be a good time for that. He introduces his wife and daughter Alice as his close friend's wife and their children, Arthur and Eleanor Lewin. The king asks them to stand up, saying Vincent's friends are also his friends. He says they are there to congratulate the Helstias on this wondrous place's 10th anniversary and to enjoy the event. The queen also says there is no need to remain so formal, that they should enjoy the event and that they are pleased that they have some company besides their guards. Meanwhile, Sylvie appears there, and the queen says it's a cute little mana beast that looks reptilian-based but more intelligent. Arthur says she just hatched several months ago and her name is Sylvie. The king asks him if this beast is his bond and calls him fortunate since infant beasts are not easy to take, yet she seems very obedient. Arthur says they are able to communicate mentally, so it's more like a mutual agreement rather than obedience. Suddenly, someone is shocked to hear this from behind and asks if he is under an equal contract with this mana beast, and Arthur says she was the one who initiated the contract. He asks him to let him take a closer look at his bond, but the king asks him to stop saying this is not a place to study someone's pet. He calls him Sebastian and says he is on duty, and he bows before him and apologizes for his behavior. Helstia calls them and asks them to have a seat since the event must be starting, while Arthur feels something weird about the mage Sebastian. After a while, a man announces that it is his highest honor to be there tonight, and he presumes all of their esteemed guests have gathered there for one reason only. This is for the chance to obtain one of the rare and valuable items at the auction. However, before they begin, he asks everyone to turn their faces toward the south. He welcomes the king and the queen of Sapin, who are also present. Everyone gets up and bows before them. Next, they will thank the man who has made this whole event possible and ask everyone to give a big round of applause for Vincent Helstia. Arthur thinks this reminds him of his past life, but he is no longer a king. Moreover, he hasn't even gone through puberty yet. After that, Ellie and Lily play, and his mother and Miss Helstia talk to the queen. He observes that the queen is a conjurer, and the fact that he couldn't sense her mana means she is carrying an artifact to hide it. She is at a level high enough that he can't sense it. He had never really thought about it before, but it's interesting how he doesn't feel any attraction to the queen or any older woman, even though they are in the same age range as he was when he died. It might be because they are his mother's age, but it's not like he finds younger girls attractive either. It's not like he has any plans on dating anytime soon, and he will think about it when he is older. In the meantime, Vincent comes to him and says a sword is up for auction right now and asks him if he wants it so he can bid. He also asks him not to worry about the price, and this is just the perk of being the owner of this place. The man announces that the short sword was forged by a master smith who is also a fire artificer. Imbued above the handle is the core of a mighty thunderhawk. He announces that reinforcing this masterful sword with just a bit of mana will produce currents of electricity around the edge of its blade, enhancing its cutting power and even exuding a paralyzing effect. He starts the bidding with 50 gold, and people start calling their amount. A modest house in Xyrus could fetch at least a single gold coin, but an average family back in his hometown of Ashbur could live just fine on a handful of copper coins in a day. The opening bid for this sword could provide a modest living for a family for over 250 years. Vincent comes to him and asks if it is to his liking, and a sword with an elemental ability is hard to come by. Arthur says it sounds like a powerful weapon, but not something he needs, and he would prefer something a little less unique. Vincent smiles and asks why he plays with a spark when he can wield lightning itself. However, this is just the beginning, and even if he doesn't find anything he likes, he manages to find all the other items he wants. He asks him if he found a voice-altering mask, and he proudly says he has found it, and even the coat he got him is made from a nightmare fox. It has the ability to obscure his presence from unsuspecting eyes. It seemed like something he would want, so he snatched it while he could. He asks him to stay safe since he is the one who will have to deal with his family if anything happens to him, while he just smiles at him. However, Vincent was right because the sword was only the beginning. There were more weapons and even several beast cores ranging from C-class all the way to a class. The king himself bid on a few of them, winning in a class beast core. But it wouldn't be until its recipient actually absorbed the core that they would learn whether or not the core contained a beast will. He seems tired, wonders when the intermission is coming, and suddenly realizes that Sylvie is not with him. He asks Lily about her, and she replies that she was just there. He looks for her behind and under the sofa, but she is nowhere. Suddenly, he finds Sebastian trying to pick her up, and he is about to grab her, but she seems sad. He thinks he needs to control himself since he is the royal family's court mage. Sylvie sees him and rushes toward him, and he turns back and asks her to go. Sebastian exclaims that the commoner in the countryside has no place frolicking around with such a special beast, and Arthur asks him what he just said. He replies that Sylvie will belong to him one day, and Arthur stares him back furiously and asks him to repeat what he just said. A moment ago, Vincent was disappointed that Arthur wasn't able to find anything he liked. From what he understands, he just wanted a good quality sword, nothing fancy or innately powerful. If that's the case, he is sure he will be able to find something in their storage. Meanwhile, the king comes to him and says he hopes he is having an enjoyable evening. He replies that he is not sure how he managed to secure an A-class beast core from a silver coat bear, but he is most pleased with his purchase. He hopes the beast will is still intact, and Vincent is glad this humble event was worth the trouble for him. Suddenly, they feel a murderous aura spreading all around. The king feels heavy, almost palpable bloodlust, but it's not even directed at him. Vincent falls to the ground, grabs his neck, and wonders what is happening to him. The guards come there and ask the queen to stay back, but she asks them to protect the children and not to worry about her. The king also takes out his sword and asks who dares to try and attack the royal family, asking him to show himself. They look at their surrounding but can't find anyone. At the same time, Sebastian seems scared of Arthur and regrets losing control of himself. Ellie starts crying while Vincent becomes normal and wonders what just happened to him. Ray and Adam also approach them and ask if everything is okay there. The guard replies to him that the room has been searched and they are fine for now and orders Ray to check the surrounding area. They check everywhere while Arthur stays quiet and doesn't tell anyone that it happened because of him. He asks Sylvie if she is okay, and she replies to him in her language. Meanwhile, a man comes to him and informs them that an intruder has been apprehended by Captain Lewin, which means everything is well now. Arthur thanks the intruder in his mind and says his sacrifice was not in vain. The guard calls Sebastian and asks how he can fall on his arse over a little intimidation from an intruder, and he replies that he just slipped. However, he is staring at Arthas, who stares back at him. The show continues, and the man announces they have the final item for tonight's event. Tradition dictates that the best item be saved for last, and he is not one for belittling tradition. He asks who will be the lucky individual fortunate enough to acquire his treasure. They ask to behold everyone and show them an infant world lion. For those who are ignorant of this magnificent mana beast, an adult world lion can become a powerful B-class mana beast. He dares say that this infant world lion could even become an A-class beast if well taken off. Sebastian observes Arthur staring at him, and he doesn't even notice the other mana beasts. The man exclaims that caring for and treasuring this fine beast will allow its master to become a legendary beast tamer. Its amount starts from 500 gold coins, and the people hurriedly raise their amounts for this. The king raises his hand for 1,000 coins, and everyone gets quiet after the king's amount. Vincent says it seems no one wants to bid against their own king, and congratulates him in advance. He thanked him for his consideration and generosity, and asked him about his plans for the new royal pet, and if he would be taming it himself. The king replies he is planning to give it to his son Curtis, and it depends on how he does, and he promises him to do his best. The queen asks him if she will not hear him avoiding his lesson, while he shouts and asks why she is telling this to his father. Arthur smiles after watching them like this, and they almost seem like a normal family. Vincent states the auction is about to end, and if he likes him to gather the items and send them over to him, the king says he will go down with him. Vincent asks him to follow them. Meanwhile, Sebastian calls the king and whispers something in his ears. Arthur has a bad feeling about this. After a while, they go downstairs, and Vincent says an attendant should be there soon with their items. He then calls Arthur and says there is everything he asked for except for a sword. He also asks him to look around and find anything he likes. Alice says she can take care of his things while he looks for a sword. The king calls him and asks if he plans to take sword lessons. He says his boy has also started learning, and they can arrange for a friendly spar between them one day. Sebastian calls him and says Prickney Curtis would only become infected with bad habits if he begins sparring with mere commoners. Arthur says he is honored, but swords are merely a hobby for him, and he could never hope to reach his son's level. Meanwhile, Ray comes there, and Vincent asks him to come there since the king wants to see him. Ray bows before him and pays his respect, and the king says he heard he was the one who captured the intruder earlier, and it seems that Vincent has gotten himself quite the capable hand. Ray gets up and says he was just merely doing his duty, and the king asks him if this child is his son. He introduces them to Sebastian and says he has been a royal guard for many years, helping their family countless times. For the exemplary services he has provided him, and therefore his country, he does feel the need to reward him at times, and it seems that he has taken quite a liking to his son's bond. He asks him to give the royal family's guard his bond, which will be a service to his kingdom. Ray is shocked at his demand and looks toward Arthur, who also seems shocked. He asks the king about what he meant by this, and the king says he is more than happy to compensate him for the bond, and hiring a mage to serve the contract between his son and the mana beast will be done at their expense. Ray bows before him and apologizes to him, saying neither he nor his wife has anything to do with his son's bond. He acquired it himself, so he can't speak on his behalf regarding this matter. Alice is also worried about this, and the king just stares at him. Arthur also stares at him, and Sebastian comes to him angrily and asks if his parents didn't teach him to lower his gaze when speaking to his superiors. The king now talks to him and says he is sure he has just heard his conversation with his father so that he won't repeat himself. He offers him a sword befitting any aspiring young knight. Arthur asks himself to keep calm since he is still the king of Sapin. Arthas bowed before him and thanked him for his gracious offer. But he must refuse since even the most magnificent sword could never replace Sylvie. Sebastian again tries to interrupt, but the king asks him to stop and asks him to trade his world lion cub that he has just purchased for his bond. Curtis is shocked and says the mana beast belonged to him, and the king asks him to think about the offer and says indeed his mana beast seems unique, but reptilian beasts rarely grow to be as strong as true predatory mana beasts. Arthur then apologizes for failing to clarify himself, but he doesn't wish to give, sell, or trade his bond. The king says he has asked him for a favor twice, and his patience runs thin, and he will ask him kindly one last time, and asks him if he will give his bond. Arthur asks him permission to ask him a question as well. He asks him how much he will be willing to sell his children for. He has asked him thrice and rejected all 3 times, yet it seems his pride won't allow him to accept his refusal, and says he doesn't seem to be aware of the gravity of what he is asking him, so he hopes his question will make it clear. He asks him how much money he requires in exchange for his son or daughter, King Glader. Everyone is shocked at his question, and Sebastian directs the guard to attack him. The guard comes to him and calls him an insolent peasant, and asks how he dares to insult the king and his family. Arthas observes he's concentrating all of his mana into his sword and wonders if he intends to cut him in half. He keeps the flow of mana calm and even anticipates the enemy's movement and takes control of the path of his strike. He moves slightly and dodges his attack, and as a result, the sword hits the ground. He disrupts his balance and explodes, using both his power and momentum against him, and punches him back with his full might. Sebastian is angry that he wasn't even able to kill a child and wasted the perfect chance. He takes out his wand and thinks that even if punished, he will take matters into his own hands. What the king doesn't realize is that a bond capable of forming an equal contract at such a young age means it will eventually grow beyond a class. He just wants the beast and tries to attack him, but he dodges him too. He is shocked that his attack wasn't of any use, and Arthur says spells that need ambient mana to fuel them won't work. He stares at him furiously while Sebastian asks everyone to stay back, and asks him if he thinks he is a match for a conjurer of the royal family. Arthur moves in no time and passes through him swiftly before he can notice him. After that, Sebastian falls to the ground and cries for his leg, which is heavily injured, and he calls everyone to help him and asks why everyone is just standing there. Arthur puts his hand on his shoulder and says no one is going to hear him, so he should listen while he is still able to. He cries and says he can't do this time because he is the personal conjurer of the king himself. He again stares at him with murderous intent and asks him to know his place. He then hits another guard while the king is watching him shockingly and wonders how this commoner child did his guard trip over his own feet or something. Suddenly, he observes Sebastian lying on the ground at a distance and wonders how he reached there. Lily is shocked to see his injured leg and cries out of fear. Everyone else is also shocked to see Sebastian's leg broken. He cries in pain and asks someone to help him, and the king is shocked to see his condition. The queen calls the guards, asks what they are doing, and asks them to check his vitals. Meanwhile, Arthur also lies there unconscious, and Ray checks out for his condition, but he is still breathing. He lifts him and Alice uses her healing powers to heal him. She is crying over his condition, and Helstia's family is just watching them quietly. After some time, he gets into consciousness in his room, and he feels so much pain in his head. He wonders how he got back to his room, and the last thing he remembers is that he used static void. He regrets that he overdid again, and thanks to Sylvia, he was able to use static void once he had unlocked the acquire phases of her dragon will. With it, he was able to separate himself from the flow of time temporarily, and it is a game-changing ability that was only available to him because he is a legacy tamer. However, it came at a cost. Despite his years of training, he was only able to use this ability for a few seconds without feeling the harsh backlash. He thinks he went over his limit, and it was his first time using static void on another person as well. He guesses he was lucky that things only ended with him falling unconscious. Meanwhile, Alice comes to his room with Sylvie and finds out that he is awake. She hugs him and says the doctor said he most likely fell unconscious from shock, and that he would wake up soon, though he would have to say the doctor's use of the word soon was rather off. It has been almost 8 hours since he fell unconscious, and Arthur regrets that he made her worry again. She asks him if something is wrong since it looks like he is in pain, and he asks her what happened after he passed out. She replies that no one was in their right state of mind, especially the kids, so the king and his family excused themselves first. His father is downstairs in the living room with the king's representative, discussing what happened, and he gets up saying he will see how he is doing downstairs. Alice says he will check up on Ellie and sleep with her just in case, and asks him if he is really fine. He replies that he is fine now and asks her to get some rest. He asks Sylvie to go with mom and comes downstairs. He hears Ray's voice, who says this isn't something that can be compensated with money, and his son was almost killed by the guards. He enters the room, and Ray is surprised to see him there. He asks him what is going on there, and he tells him that the king's representative just tossed a few gold coins as a token of apology from the king for what he said was a small incident. The man gets up and asks if he is Arthur Lewin. He introduces himself as Jasper Cogwright, and is there on behalf of His Majesty to extend his utmost condolences for what happened today. He thinks he will just play the modest victim and thanks him for coming all this way. The king says he has told his father most of what happened, but he also wanted to inform them too that both guards who attacked him have been relieved of their positions. Ray asks him if the king slapped them on the wrist and waved them goodbye, and the representative says his son spoke out of turn in front of His Majesty. They both glare at each other, and Arthur says Mr. Cogwright isn't wrong, and he was out of line as well. Besides, he is not hurt, so they should just end this matter. He then smirked and asked him about the conjurer, whose knee had broken. He replies that Sebastian has been stripped of his position, and the injury he sustained is currently being treated. He asks him if they were able to assess what exactly happened to his leg, and he replies that upon waking up, Sebastian was adamant, saying that he was the one that inflicted that injury. Ray shouts at him and asks how this even makes sense, and Mr. Cogwright asks him to let him finish first. He exclaims that judging by the lingering mana on his staff, they believe that the mana released from the first knight who had acted out ricocheted and interfered with Sebastian's spell. Arthur wonders if this whole thing will just end like that, and he leaves from there after some time. Ray gives him the money and says he is the one who almost died, and besides, he is going to need some money when he starts off as an adventurer. He then asks him to return to sleep and get some rest, and he thanks him for this. He then puts the money in a drawer and thinks the situation with Sebastian has managed to blow over without any problems, but it makes him all too conscious that he is still only a kid in this world. However, it will be different when he is on an adventure and checks out the things Vincent gave, and he thinks he may be let loose a little. The next morning, they go to Twin Horns and tell them about Arthur's adventure. They ask them who wants to accompany him. Adam refuses by saying babysitting isn't his forte, and with his personality, his son might kill him in his sleep one day. Everyone agrees with him, while Arthur just laughs at his comment. Ray says he was hoping Durden or Helen would accompany him and says they can't offer much, but Alice and he are more than willing to compensate them in whatever way they can if they do this for them. Durden says they are family and he would love to accompany Arthur and watch his grow. Helen also says they wouldn't do this for the money. Besides, they managed to get quite a bit of treasure from their last dungeon raid. Suddenly, they are shocked to see that Jasmine herself offers to go with him. Angela is also surprised because they know that she hates escorting missions even more than Adam. She replies that she can do this for Arthur, and Helen says that she is the most suitable person to protect him. Durden specializes mostly in defensive area of effect spells for larger parties, and protection isn't Helen's strong suit either. Alice asks Jasmine if she is sure she is fine doing this, and she assures him of this. Adam also asks them to let her go, since she is the only augmenter among them with an elemental affinity. She just broke the light orange stage last year, and with her wind attribute, she is probably best suited. Durden also agrees and says he would have liked to accompany Arthur, but it doesn't make sense for more than one of them to go. Ray says he may go next time. Arthur smiles and says he will be her care for now, and she just smiles at him. After that, they return home, and Ellie gets angry to see Lily train without her. He thinks Lilia is able to meditate on her own a bit, even without him imbuing mana into her, and Ellie should be able to awaken at age 7 or 8 if she actually has the patience to meditate. Still, maybe it's for the better that she doesn't awaken too early. He doesn't like the idea of all of that attention on her. He then calls Ray and asks if the auction house is real quick, and he wants to pick out a sword since he couldn't the last time they were there. Alice asks them not to stay there too long, and she is going to start preparing dinner right now. At the same time, Lily's father and mother had been working at the auction house and were waiting for them. It was the first time he had seen either of them since the incident, and he was faced with a long string of questions from them regarding his health. He did his best to reassure them that he was fine and that he was happy it was all over, but they were less than pleased by the king's behavior regarding this incident. Vincent is sure those 2 guards getting fired is just a temporary measure until things cool down, and it won't be long before they have their positions back, and Ray also thinks the same. Arthur interrupts them and says they came there because he needed to find a sword before he took his application test at the Adventurers Guild. Vincent asks him to follow them and says it might take some time for them to find something he likes, but he is free to dig around. They enter a huge store, and Arthur is very impressed by this. At first, he is happy, but soon he is disappointed that there are so many different types of swords, but nothing that he wants. He thinks it must be because of how many warriors in this world are augmenters, but there are so many more two-handed swords or large one-handed ones. His search for a dependable sword that he could use with this smaller body bore little fruit. He was tempted to give up and find a more unique weapon in the meantime. After a while, he sees Sylvie looking for something and asks her if she finds anything. She takes out a stick, and Arthur says this is not something he was looking for. He doesn't know what she wants him to do with the stick. However, he feels the stick is heavy, and the balance is off for just a stick, and it is almost as if this is a sword. He tries to unsheath it, but it doesn't open, and he wonders if he needs to imbue it with mana in order to use it. He continued to test his theory by utilizing all of the elements at his disposal, but the sword remains stuck. After some time, he is tired and wonders how it will open if it is not with a specific element. He then sees toward his arm, which has been covered by Sylvia's wind, and uses her beast will to open the sword. The sword unsheaths easily, and as he gazed down at the sword's translucent teal blade, he couldn't help but think. He uses some sword techniques and finds it to be a beautiful weapon, too much so to be considered a weapon. However, the sword and sheath are too heavy for him to use right now properly. Suddenly, he thinks of something and tears the drum lying in front of him using the sword. Some letters appear on it, showing the sword belongs to Dawn. Suddenly, his hand burns and the sword falls from his hand. Sylvie comes to him, and he tells her that he is fine. She wonders what happened to the sword suddenly. He again picks it up, and this time, the weight and balance change. He uses his sword techniques to check it up. Not only that, but the handle and length of the blade have been shortened a bit in order to accommodate this body best. With access to the finest weapon, he had held a priceless sword in his hands for dozens of years, yet he had never felt one that matched so perfectly with him than now. He then swiftly moves through the drum, which slashes into 2 parts. The sword has a clean cut, and Arthur seems to like it. While extremely rare, there have been cases where master artificers have been able to create staffs and wands that have the ability to bond with a single user. The weapon would basically calibrate itself, allowing better manipulation of mana between weapon and master. But he would never read of any cases where a sword had the ability to bind itself to a user. In the meantime, Ray and Viknit enter the store and ask him to leave since they are getting late. He then comes to them, and Arthur asks him if he has found anything he likes. He exclaims that it is not as fancy as some of the other swords there, but it grows on him after he takes a few swings. Vincent tells him that it has been auctioned in one of the smaller stalls a few times, but no one bid for it. He takes out the sword and tries some sword skills with it, and Vincent asks him if he likes it. He replies that the weight distribution is a bit off because the creator was trying to make this light, but Arthur thinks it would be a good fit. He also asks him about the stick he got there, and Arthur thinks he needs to play this cool. He replies that he tripped over this on the way back there, and it's pretty sturdy and heavy, so he thought it would be a good practice tool. Vincent doesn't remember seeing this before, and he asks him permission to see it, and asks the assistant if he has any records of a cane like this. He replies that he remembers that stick, and one of his merchants told him a rather peculiar story about some senile old man who just threw this at him, mumbling about no one being worthy. They have had multiple inspectors check it out in case, and it appears to be a sturdy, hard cane, but it is a bit odd. Perhaps they can find a higher tier artificer to check it out. Arthur calls him Uncle Vincent for the first time and asks permission to have it because he likes it a bit. Vincent happily agrees to give him the stick, and he is happy that Arthur calls him uncle. After that, they celebrate his birthday, and he thanks everyone for being with him for another year. They are happy that he is 9 years old, and Vincent says there is no reminiscing until after their little celebration. They serve them with a grand dinner, and everyone is happy to see a number of dishes there. Hestia asks them to get their hands in there and start eating. They had a good time and clicked many family pictures, and the birthday party ended with happy memories. They are playing a game, and Adam makes fun asking him to remember the time the back of his pant caught on fire, and he had to go back into town to convert his own bare ass. Durden gets embarrassed about this, and Jasmine tells Adam that he seems to have forgotten when a horned mole snuck up right under him while relieving himself in a dungeon. She recalls that he got so scared that he landed flat on his back, pissing on himself like a fountain. Everyone laughs at him loudly, while Adam is so embarrassed and says he thought everyone was sleeping at that time. After that, Ray exclaims they have finished dinner and Adam has been thoroughly humiliated so that they will move on to presents. They give him a present from his family, and he asks Ellie to come with her and open it together. They give him leather gloves, and Alice reveals that the leather is from spiked aurochs, which his father hunted and skinned himself. She imbued a minor healing spell into each of those 3 gems. Each gem only carries a single-use spell, but he figured having some safety measures would be a good idea when he goes out on missions. He likes the gloves, and thanks both of them for the gift. Next is Vincent. He gives him a pair of rings in a romantic way, but Hestia hits him from behind and asks him not to tease the boy. Vincent sadly says nobody there appreciates a little showmanship, and he gives one ring to Arthur, and the other is for Alice. She reveals that as long as Arthur wears his ring, the gem on the ring Alice has will light up if Arthur's mana level drops down to a dangerous level. Alice hugs her and thanks her for the gift because it assures her of her son's safety. Arthur thinks the ring seems more like a double-edged sword, and it can free his family from constantly worrying about him, but it can also keep her constantly tense, waiting for the ring to go off. Adam says how they can beat their gifts, and because their son is so strong, they actually thought along the same lines as the Hestia family. They offer him something, saying the little monster doesn't need anything, and they think that the whole family would appreciate it. They give him sound transmission scrolls, and Adam will not elaborate on how expensive they are, but Jasmine hits him from behind before telling him the price. He reveals that, with this, he now has a one-time source of communication that he thinks pairs quite nicely with his new rings. He can just infuse mana into the scroll and record a message, and once Alice gets the message, she can reply once, and after confirming that the message has been relayed back to Arthur, the 2 scrolls will turn into ashes. Ray then asks him if he is excited about tomorrow, and Alice asks him to promise her to be safe since it doesn't matter what rank he becomes or how rich he is able to get. He thinks he will come back home every chance he gets. After that, the twin horns leave their home and say goodbye. Arthur thinks that he has a family now and people who love him, and it is a feeling he never wants to give up. He would treasure it and fight for it if he had to. For that, he needed to better himself, even when he was a king. The next morning, he wants to shower Sylvie, but she doesn't want it and tries to run from the bathroom, while he is trying to drag her back. She uses her mana to push him away, and he gets angry. He uses his mana too and throws her into the bathtub, while she just sees him with a crying face. After that, he is ready for his adventurer's test, and Ray and Alice are waiting for him downstairs. Ray sees him effectively and says he already looks like an S-class adventurer, and he advises him to know his limits even though he is strong. He also trusts Jasmine when things get rough. Ellie is crying and doesn't let him go and asks him if he can't stay for a little longer. Alice and Ray are also sad and they try to hold Ellie back, saying he will be back before she knows it. He holds her hand and says she is a big girl now and he has an important job for her. He asks her to protect Mom and Dad while he is gone for a bit, and she hugs him saying she has been practicing a lot and she got lots of little lights together now and she can protect them. He thinks he has missed so much of his sister's life and knows his short time there wasn't enough. However, in order to protect all of them, this was a step he needed to take. He sadly looks toward Alice, but she asks him not to look at her with that face and she will be fine soon. They all greet them, and Ray says they will all be fine, and Alice asks him not to forget to keep his ring on. When he is about to leave, Ray calls him and says they will always be rooting for him. When he comes outside, Jasmine is already waiting for him and asks if he is ready. He wears his mask and asks her to go for now. After that, they go for the adventurer test, and Jasmine observes that his bond looks different today. He replies that he found out recently that she is able to alter her form slightly. This way, she looks just like a black lizard. They go to the counter where a woman welcomes them at the Xyrus Adventurers' Guild Hall and asks how she can help them. Jasmine gives her a form and says she wants to sponsor him for a rank examination. She then asks them to follow her and says they have a few taking examinations today, but on account of having a sponsor, they will bump them closer to the front of the queue so they won't have to wait as long. She takes them to a room, while the other contestants whisper about him. They enter a room where the woman informs a man that a class adventurer, Jasmine Flamesworth, has requested this gentleman to be taken in for a rank examination. The man asks the woman to wait outside and asks Jasmine about how she is. She met with her father not long ago, but she stares at him angrily. He introduces himself as Caspian Bladeheart, who is in charge of this branch. He exclaims that there is usually an application to be filled out along with an inspection of his mana core before a series of practical exams. Still, since Miss Flamesworth is sponsoring him, he will waive those steps. He wonders if Jasmine's family is that special, and Caspian says the only thing remaining is for him to do a mock duel against one of their examiners. Judging by his weapons, he observes that he may be a fighter or augmenter. He states that names aren't mandatory to become a registered adventurer, but seeing that he has a close relationship with Jasmine, so he asks him if there is a way to address him. The previous night, when he was staring at the mask, he thought this kind of reminded him of a hard note on a music sheet. So he decides to take his name as note, and he observes Hai just shaking his hand that the man is very strong. Caspian says Miss Mary will show them to the examination hall, and he just leaves by staring at him. He finds out that the Flamesworth house was mentioned with a fair degree of respect, and he wonders if this is why she wants to accompany him. However, he observed that she seemed pretty upset at the mention of her father back then. Miss Mary shows them a route that will directly take them to the base level where the testing occurs. He requests them to be mindful and head directly up the stairs and remain seated until his name is called. They enter a large room where two contestants are fighting each other. One is attacking while the other is dodging, and he attacks him again, asking him to try to dodge this one. He announces his next attack by the name of Hell Smash, and Arthur wonders why he is announcing his next attack. Just like how conjurers chanted spells to focus their intent, many augmenters similarly chose to vocalize the name of their attack. Arthur thinks it was a bit excessive for such a simple move, and the man is shocked at how he is being defeated. He shouts at him and says some grandmothers swing their walking canes better than he can flail around that polearm of years. The other adventurer says he depends too much on physical strength compared to his mana reinforcement, throwing his attacks balance off, and his attacks are laughably transparent. He is apparently 35, but he is only at the dark orange stage. The man starts crying and says he has completed his training. He says he would normally put someone of his caliber in E class, but seeing as how he has a fire affinity, he gives him a D rank. Next, they call Diane Whitehall for the exam, and a girl appears there. But she got stuck on the stairs and fell to the ground. Everyone laughs at him, and one of them says they should put her in E class and that it's just a waste of time to test her. Arthur observes him from a distance and thinks he seems very strong. The girl comes there and introduces her to Diane Whitehall, age 18, a conjurer at the solid orange stage with a single specialization in water. A lady says she doesn't need to introduce herself. They already have their information. She asks her to ready her weapon and know that there are medical staff and an emitter on site in case any injuries arise from their test. Once a conjurer has reached the orange stage, it's apparent where their specialty lies. Rather than trying to become adept at all four elements, focusing solely on the element of one's highest affinity was much more efficient. Arthur heard that for conjurers, claiming dual specialization and up meant the test would be stricter to more accurately test whether the applicants were really adept at multiple elements. The woman says they will now see what he has got Miss Whitehall, and the girl casts a spell to attack her. Jasmine tells her that conjurers aren't as proficient in reinforcing their bodies with mana as augmenters. They are trained very strictly to set up defensive measures first during battle. The examiner mage uses her earth attribute and dodges her attack in just an instance. Arthur finds it interesting and thinks the examiner used that spell to block Diane's vision within her protective water sphere. Diane casts another spell and tries to cast another spell, but the examiner dodges her every time. Suddenly, her water turns into a blast of fog, and she casts another spell to attack the examiner. Suddenly, she disappears and appears behind her, and she says her control is quite decent and that his last spell chain was well practiced. She was a bit overconfident about not preparing another defensive measure, but his efficiency in mana control and cast and speed were good. She gives him a C-class rank, and Arthur thinks C-class at her age is something she should definitely proud of. The announcer next calls Elijah Knight, but she shows something to the examiner on his list. Suddenly, the examiner says he has been informed of his status and is hereby assigned the rank of B-class adventurer. Everyone wonders how they give him a B-class when he doesn't need to get tested. The boy gets up from his seat, and Arthur stares at him. They call the next contestant, Lucas Wykes, and he is the boy from earlier. He also exclaims that they should skip over him and just place him in a class. She reads his characteristics, such as that he is 11 years old, a conjurer at the light orange stage, and a single specialization in fire. Arthur is also surprised to see that he is at the light orange stage at 11, while the examiner doesn't like him and thinks he is just an arrogant child. She asks him to start the test and see what he can do. He uses his fire attributes and raises his fire protector, and the other examiner is impressed to see a decent and stable flame guardian. It looks like they have a special talent today. They can expect this from a member of the Wykes family and create a firewall in front of him. He then casts a spell, and the examiner says it seems he wasn't just full of hot air, but his disrespect shows that he needs to learn some humility. Therefore, she creates a dust wall that annihilates his fire. Arthur thinks it was a good move from the examiner, and the flame guardian will be naturally extinguished once it uses up the limited oxygen inside the tomb. But Lucas smiles and casts another spell, saying it's too late. Arthur has heard that there has never been a case where an examiner has gotten injured while testing new adventurers. He uses hundreds of flames to attack him, and the examiner finds it difficult to dodge all of them simultaneously. She then tries to dodge, but the attack strength is so much powerful that she has to run in order to dodge. She then rushes toward him, creates multiple attacks, and reaches behind him. She creates a soil's hand and makes it grab his leg, and Lucas isn't able to release it. He shouts loudly and asks her to release him. Soon, he has been defeated by the examiner and falls to the ground. She exclaims his raw mana pool and ability to learn high-tier fire affinity spells speak volumes of his potential, but Lucas again gets up and says the attack is not over yet. The examiner was unguarded, so she wasn't able to dodge him, but the other examiner rushes in time and blocks his attack. Lucas gets angry with him and asks how he dares to interrupt his exam. The examiner replies he was the one who broke the regulation and initiated a surprise spell despite the examination ending. Lucas shouts and calls the examiner a witch and says she was the one who got in the way of his next attack by blocking those fire beams. She was the one who deemed the test complete even though he had everything under control. The examiner asks her to announce his result, and she states that his mana pool and control are both excellent. Despite the faults displayed from lack of experience, it is more than reasonable to place him into Class B. Lucas seems in a very bad mood, but quietly gets upstairs. Some contestants congratulate him for getting a B class, but he shouts at them and asks them not to compare themselves to him. He thinks they have to wait until their father hears of this, and next, they call Arthur for the test. Jasmine wishes him luck, and he goes there thinking about approaching this sort of warrior best. The examiner has years of training and experience with his sword, and his movement was explosive and sharp, but he wasn't without gaps in his defense. The examiner asks him to hurry and says they don't have it all day. It seems like he is testing under special conditions, seeing as they don't have any information on him, and they will see what he can do. He is scared to feel so much pressure from him, but Caspian reaches there and interrupts them all. He then exclaims that he will be the one to test this particular examinee, and the examiner is surprised that he will be personally examining the candidate. He asks him if there is really a need for an A class to lower himself to test an examinee, especially a mage of his caliber, and Caspian replies he is not questioning his strength. Still, he feels obligated to test himself, seeing as his sponsor and has sharp, deep ties. He asks Arthur if he agrees with this and is ready to give the test. However, on examination grounds, people sit there to watch the duel between Arthur and Caspian. Arthur and Caspian stood before each other. Caspian took his sword from the holder and saw Arthur holding his sword. Think the man who stood before him was not only in charge of the biggest guild halls in Sapin, but was an A-class adventurer himself. Caspian swung his sword, and Arthur, looking toward him, thought he had no apparent openings, and the pressure of his bloodlust was heavy, as if he had no intention of making this a standard test. Caspian points his sword toward Arthur, while Arthur, looking toward him, smiles, thinking why he is so excited. Caspian, pointing his sword toward him, says please prepare himself, and don't take this special treatment to heart. Arthur, pointing his sword toward him, nods. Caspian runs toward him and attacks him with his sword, but in time, Arthur swings his sword and back turns downwards. Caspian's sword collides with Arthur's sword, and the clash of these swords causes fire ashes. Arthur grits his teeth, thinking he is fast. Caspian pushes Arthur's sword, and he falls backward on the ground. Caspian swings his sword to attack him. Seeing this, Arthur, lying on the ground, gets surprised and quickly rolls from Caspian's front to the backside. Caspian creates his wind magic and turns to attack while Arthur stands there. He sees that wand magic is created around him and is surprised. Meanwhile, Caspian runs toward him from behind to attack. Arthur turns his head quickly and moves toward him. Caspian extends his hand to attack him with his sword, but before he attacks him, Arthur bumps into him. Caspian surprisingly stopped there. Arthur rolls and jumps backward, swinging his sword. Caspian smiles and wipes his sweat, complimenting Arthur as excellent. After this, Caspian, creating his wind magic, runs toward Arthur, and in response, Arthur, holding his sword, also runs toward him. However, both of their swords collide with each other. Arthur swings his sword, but Caspian moves backward. Arthur rolls and turns toward him. Caspian also turns and extends his hand to attack him with his sword. Caspian attacks Arthur and cuts the skin off his face with his sword. When he sees this, Arthur is surprised and strikes his sword to attack Caspian. Caspian quickly moves behind his back, and dust emerges from the ground due to his speed. After this, Arthur jumped ahead, and Caspian stood at his back run toward him. Arthur ran ahead, turned Caspian toward him, and extended his hand to attack him. Caspian's sword was about to stab Arthur's neck, but before it, Arthur moved and turned his neck backward. The sword passed by him. Seeing this, Caspian smiled and ran toward Arthur, while Arthur moved backward, thinking it was clear as they fought what his disadvantages were. Further, he thought his muscles were undeveloped, and he was more than a foot shorter than he was used to when he was in his sword fighting prime. His body, more rigid from the assimilation of Sylvia's dragon will, was still weaker against a veteran fighter whose body was enhanced and clad thickly in mana. However, Caspian starts using mana and throws the wind magic toward Arthur. Arthur hardly crosses the wind magic and jumps down. Then he quickly runs toward Caspian and strikes his sword to attack him, But before he attacks, Caspian clangs with Arthur's sword and pushes him back. Arthur was about to fall back, but he jumped backward and stood far from him. Arthur starts to tremble, thinking that even with his training, he is still not accustomed to this undeveloped body. Caspian creates his mana, and the green aura emerges from his body. He extends his hand and holds the sword toward Arthur, saying he must apologize for underestimating him. Then he slightly smiles, saying he will be a bit more serious. Now he hears this, Arthur trembles, thinking that at that moment, his body screamed at him to move. Caspian strikes his sword, throws his mana toward Arthur, and sees Arthur run away. Caspian, with his mana, creates the wind bullets and throws them toward him while Arthur runs. The bullets hit the wall at his back, and the wall gets cracked. Caspian turns and moves, creating his mana, saying Arthur seems like Miss Flamesworth has picked up someone worthwhile after all. Hearing this, Arthur, running, gets surprised, then turns and looks toward Caspian. As he turns, Caspian throws the wind bullets toward him. Arthur quickly moves down, thinking the wind bullets are fast and near impossible to see, but their trajectories are predictable. As the wind bullets in large numbers move toward him, Arthur can hardly save himself from these wind bullets by jumping and rolling on the ground. However, Caspian, with his wind mana, was throwing the wind bullets toward him. Arthur, moving toward him, cut the wind bullets with his sword, thinking he needed to close the distance if he at least wanted a fighting chance. Arthur jumps and rolls while crossing the wind bullets and moving toward Caspian. He also creates fire magic, attacks the wind bullets with his fireball, and breaks it. Arthur was moving toward him while Caspian was throwing wind bullets toward him from his side. Arthur gets closer to him, thinking he is in range, and he creates fire magic and covers his sword with fire magic. As the fire was emerging from his sword, the trainers and Jasmine were surprised to see it. However, Arthur, with his flaming sword, cut the wind's magic, and Caspian stood before him smiling, thinking that he was a fire mage. Arthur strikes his flaming sword, and Caspian moves toward him and swings his sword to stop Arthur's sword. As both of them created their magic and pushed each other's swords, wind magic and fire emerged from the point where both swords collided. Moreover, the fire and the wind explosion occurred there, and they stood before each other, pushing swords. Arthur stood before him, pushing his sword, and looked toward him. His one eye was glowing due to his fire magic activation. While Caspian pushed his sword, he smiled, thinking the outcome should have been clear. He was an A-class adventurer, capable of long-range spells most augments would kill for. Further, with a smile, he stared at Arthur and questioned why he was nervous. Suddenly, Caspian grits his teeth, thinking no, this can't be. Then, while gritting his teeth and throwing his wind magic toward him, he says they don't get cocky. Arthur is surprised when the strong gust of magic wind pushes him backward. Both stood far from each other, creating and sending their magic toward each other. Caspian strikes his sword and throws the wind storm toward Arthur, and in return, Arthur also sends fire magic toward the wind magic to cut it. After seeing this, Jasmine surprisingly gets up from the boundary and raises her voice note. As soon as Jasmine gets up, Sylvie falls from her lap. Caspian creates the wind magic by swinging his sword and throwing the wind bullets toward Arthur, while Arthur stands in the distance, creating fire magic, and gets surprised. Thinking he hadn't even regained his footing, he snapped. As the wind bullets were about to hit Arthur, but before this, he jumped up and created the piston stamp magic. Then he flew in the air and moved toward Caspian to attack him. While Caspian stood down and sent wind magic toward the ground, Arthur stood there. As he notices Arthur coming toward him in the air, creating flame magic, he turns his wind magic storm toward Arthur. Arthur's face hit the windstorm, and he fell, thinking he had come too far, while Caspian stood before him smiling, saying impressive. Looking toward Caspian, Arthur believes his casting speed is even faster. Caspian, with his wind magic storm, attacks Arthur. Arthur stood there and started dragging toward Caspian because of that gust of windstorm. Arthur, lying down on the ground, was surprised. While Caspian throws the windstorm toward him, Arthur sits up and quickly moves from that area and activates his flaming sword, thinking he keeps pushing him to force more of his cards. Moreover, Arthur burst from the ground, thinking so be it. He created his flame magic, tearing through the air, moved toward Caspian, and grabbed his hand in which he held the sword and created wind magic. Caspian had already witnessed Piston Stamp, but this spell Arthur had devised truly shone when used in near-instant succession. Arthur, grabbing his hand, gets closer to Caspian and then looks into his eyes. Also, the bright aura is released from Arthur's eyes. Caspian looks toward him and grits his teeth, thinking, will he lose? Caspian shouts and throws the windstorm with all his might. Arthur fell away with this gust of wind, and everybody stood there to see that fight, including the trainers, Jasmine, Lucas, and Elijah. Surprisingly put their hands over their faces because that windstorm was so fast. Arthur sits on the ground and creates his flame magic to attack him. But suddenly, he is surprised to see the wind start swirling. And Caspian, standing in his windstorm, turns his storm wind toward Arthur. Also, Arthur doesn't accept his defeat and resists this wind magic with full force. Caspian angrily looked toward Arthur pant. Seeing this, Jasmine stood up on the boundaries, took out her dagger, raising her voice, Arthur note. Also, Sylvia started making noise, but he stood there on the ground, answering her screw this. However, Arthur thinks two schools of lightning magic exist, external and internal. At the same time, the books say that internal lightning magic is too complicated for mages to learn for a relatively small increase in power, but he disagrees. Arthur angrily swung his flaming sword, thinking with his enhanced speed and reflexes, he should be able to dodge everything he hoped. Also, his eyes glowed and his body turned black. Arthur runs toward him to attack. Suddenly, he crackles there because Caspian releases his magic. Surprised, Arthur stood there and Caspian put his sword in the holder. He says he got a bit carried away trying to test his limits. His apologies. Then he turns his eyes and looks toward Arthur, who says that given that he so adamantly withheld his full abilities until the end, he can only assume that he wishes to be placed at a lower rank. Arthur scratched his mask, thinking he noticed, and there, the trainer announced Note B rank while the people in the stadium whispered to each other. Did he see what a monster B rank was? Lucas angrily grits his teeth while Elijah silently stands there. After this, Caspian turns and looks toward the door of his Xyrus Guild Hall. The receptionist stands at the entrance, holding the upper shirt and waiting for him. Caspian turns, looking toward Arthur, and asks if he is sure he has no problem with this. In response, Arthur nods. Jasmine and Sylvia from the stadium run toward Arthur, and they both come to him. Jasmine puts a hand on his shoulder while Sylvia brushes his legs. Arthur stands behind and looks toward Caspian, leaving. Caspian is angry, and his receptionist is coming after him. However, the trainer gets up angrily, looks around, raises his hand, and says it is today's last examination, and goes to the front desk to receive their adventurer's card, now dismissed. Caspian, wearing his overshirt, steps into Xyrus Guild Hall toward his office, while Arthur stands behind, looking toward him. After this, Caspian sat on the chair in his office, and was thinking about Arthur when he, while using his fire magic, jumped and came near him and looked into his eyes. Thinking back to that time, Caspian sighed and leaned back on the chair with his head back. Meanwhile, the trainer slammed the door and entered, asking Sir please explain what was happening. The examiner was also with him. Caspian, seeing them there, closed his eyes and held his head, answering the door behind him. On his way in, the trainer closed the door carefully. Both of them come to Caspian. The examiner worriedly asks Sir, what is going on? There were more B-class candidates today than there have been for the last 4 months. The trainer worriedly adds his point, not to mention that all three look to be kids. Light orange at 11 is almost unprecedented amongst humans, sir. Caspian silently listens to both of them and then raises his hand. As soon as he raises his hand, they get surprised and silent. After this, Caspian asks them if they both remember what happened half a year ago in Hyris. The lady examiner asks Caspian if that was when the first tournament between the three races took place. While the trainer stood beside her, looking up, she remembered that time. Caspian opened his table drawer, answering that most Adventurers Guild employees have yet to be informed. But he was notified several weeks ago that the ban on elves and dwarves becoming licensed adventurers under seinen has been lifted. He removed the diary from the drawer and put it on the table before them, saying today's batch includes some representative examinees. Then he opened that diary while the trainer stood before him and put his hands on the table, asking Sir if he meant to say that all three were dwarves or elves. While the examiner lady stood beside him, he was thinking something. Caspian, while reading the diary, puts his index finger on the trainer's head and pulls him back, saying Lucas Wykes is a half-elf who has been residing in Seinen. The information on his birth is classified, but if he had to guess, he was most likely born to an elf slave. Further, while reading the diary, he says that House Wykes has always had a bad reputation for dabbling in nefarious methods of breeding better mages for their houses. He is an unusual case though, being so adept in flame affinity that despite his elf lineage, he awakened at 8 early, even by elf standards. He was forced to be an adventurer to enhance his abilities through real battles, and it looks like his family hit a limit on how much progress he could make through beast cores and elixirs to expedite his growth. Then, while pointing to the diary page on which Lucas's bio was written, he says Elijah Knight, on the other hand, is quite the mystery, and according to the file, his origin is unknown. But he was raised among dwarves from a young age and was sent as one of the first representatives from the kingdom of dwarves to assimilate into the human kingdom. However, the lady examiner asks why he was placed automatically into B class without being tested. Caspian leans back in the chair and closes his eyes, answering Mr. Knight had awakened only a few months ago and is only at the dark red stage. Despite this, his abilities have been credited, and the person sponsoring him isn't someone he can refute. After this, Caspian, while thinking, says although he is curious about his abilities and that masked augmenter today, he is interested. He hears about Arthur. The trainer gets scared, holds his neck and gulps, saying he has no idea who the note is. Caspian turns the diary page and comes to Arthur's information page, and nothing is written about his information. Only his name, picture, and sword are mentioned. Caspian saw this smile and set his glasses, saying he wasn't representing a noble family of elves and dwarves, that is certain. He is just curious about what kind of person Miss Flamesworth would be willing to sponsor. Surprisingly, the lady examiner, putting her hand on her mouth, asks for Flamesworth as in House Flamesworth. Moreover, she asks about the house famous for birthing and raising some of their kingdom's most potent fire attribute mages. The trainer stands beside her, turns his eyes, and looks toward her. Then he looks down to add his point, which is why he is so skilled in fire mages. Caspian opened the drawer and put that diary in it, answering the information he had told them would soon become public knowledge. Then he, looking toward them, set his glasses, saying however, he trusts that they too will refrain from discussing it with others until an announcement has been officially made. Both of them nod and then leave the office. Caspian sits on the chair, folds his arms, leans back, and closes his eyes, thinking about Arthur and that masked augmenter. His fire magic is unique yet efficient. But he is wrong, George. His sword art makes him a beast, while his movements are sometimes slightly off. It was almost like he wasn't yet comfortable with his own body, and he couldn't imagine how terrifying he would be when he grew older. Then Caspian arranged the information paper, thinking that, nevertheless, with the ban lifted, elves and dwarves would not only be able to become adventurers there, but also students. Therefore, considering this Caspian smile, he believes this continent is entering a new and exciting era. On the other side, Tesha stands on the balcony of her palace, thinking about Arthur. With a sad face, she put her hand under her face and sighed, recalling some years ago when she was shouting for Arthur. The man, her maid, was trying to calm her, and then they both came near the orb to see their future. Tesha, with the help of that orb, tries to know her future with Arthur and Sylvia's pictures appear in the orb. Then she sees Arthur standing beside her sister, and they both are happy. Watching this all in the orb, she gets surprised, her eyes wide open. She stands on the balcony and hits the parapet so hard that it gets cracked. Then, while hitting the parapet, she thinks she should be happy that he has returned and is having a good time with his family. Then, with the orb's help, she finds Arthur kissing a girl's hand, and they both lovingly look toward each other and see this. Tesha angrily thinks, but who is that girl? Isn't Arthur acting a little too nice to her? The girl looking toward Arthur blushes, saying he has significantly improved his training. It's all thanks to him. Sees this all, Tesha grits her teeth, saying how cunning. Then she angrily slams the door of her room and enters the room, saying Arthur was her friend first. After this, she angrily poofs on the pillows and sighs, and the orb is lying beside her on the pillow. She turns and looks toward the orb where Arthur's childhood picture appears. She touched the orb, saying maybe she should have treated him nicer while he was there, and then she shouted no, it's Arthur's fault for always treating her like a kid. Then she, while holding the orb, considers Arthur's dummy. Meanwhile, her grandfather bams the door and enters, saying young one, he has good news. Tesha, lying on the pillows, quickly sits up and hides the orb, yells at Grandpa, and whacks the pillow in his head. Grandpa stood before her with a smiley face and pointed to her, saying he saw she was using that orb again. Tesha shouted at him, asking Grandpa what she had said about knocking. While Grandpa laughed, she threw more pillows toward him, and he, while moving, caught those pillows. After this, while laughing, he asks her if he is all for having Arthur as his grandson-in-law, but he thinks it's a bit too early, doesn't she think? Tesha was angry with Grandpa and sat back to him. Grandpa came near her and sat beside her, saying don't put now. Then he extended his hand toward her, saying he had some good news for her little one. She hears this, with her back to him, and angrily answers. She listens, and then Grandpa asks her what would happen if he said she could have the chance to attend the same school that Arthur would be at. As soon as this voice comes to her ears, she excitedly turns and holds Grandpa, asking. She repeats this word 3 times, asking if he is not lying to her right. Further, she excitedly asks if it is true that she can go to school with Arthur when Grandpa sees her. That level of excitement gets surprised. Meanwhile, her parent enters the room. Her mother, with a smiley face, looks toward her and asks her to calm down. Then she answers yes, her grandfather indeed has close ties with the director of Xyrus Academy. Grandpa laughs and adds that the sly old fox was bragging to her about finding a quadra-elemental augmenter when he was the one who trained him. After this, Grandpa holds the orb to check it while Tesha's father laughs, saying, but it's a bit more complicated than just sending her to school. Further, he says well, that was just the beginning. Then her mother adds her point, asking her if she remembers the Continental Tournament, and her father, putting his hand on her mother's back, says, they are negotiating the terms for integrating the younger generations of elves and dwarves with the humans at Xyrus Academy. Tesha's grandfather gives that orb to her, telling the director told him that Arthur plans on adventuring for 3 years. So, if all goes well, she will be his senior in school by the time he starts attending Xyrus Academy. Tesha's father smiles and adds his point about training hard with her grandfather. After all, it will be the start of a new generation. Hearing this all, Tesha excitedly smiles and holds the orb in which Arthur's picture appeared. After this, all the students waited for their licenses in the academy hall. Some were sitting on the bench, while others were in the lane for their turn. The receptionist individually calls their name and gives them their license. Both Arthur and Jasmine were sitting on the bench there. Jasmine asked if he was okay. Arthur looked down, remembering the fight with Caspian, and answered he was all right. Then, looking toward his hand, he said it was fun. Arthur turns his head and looks toward her, asking if she and Caspian are close to Jasmine, while Sylvia sits on his shoulder, moves up, and turns to listen to her answer. Jasmine turns her eyes and stays silent. Then, looking aside, she answers in a way that sees Jasmine's facial expression. Sylvia gets sad, and tears start flowing from her eyes. Then Jasmine, looking aside, tells her father has deep connections within the Adventurers Guild, and Caspian is one of them. Arthur turned his head to listen to her also. Sylvia sat on his shoulder with a sad face folded in her arms, aborting the mission. Arthur turns his eyes and listens to her. Meanwhile, the receptionist calls Arthur's name. Both Jasmine and Arthur get up and move toward the reception counter, while the other candidates sit in the other lane of the bench, surprisingly look toward them. Both pass by the candidates to get near the counter. As they pass, the candidates look toward Arthur's whisper. One says the kid is nuts, and the other sits beside him and asks if he is a kid. In contrast, their companion stands beside them and gets near them, saying a shorter word as the 3 of them are whispering. Sylvia sits on Arthur's shoulder to listen to their conversation. After this, the receptionist, looking through the glass wall toward Arthur, says thanks for waiting. She has been informed about the results of his mock duel, Mr. Note. Then she extended her hand and passed the license box under the glass, sending and receiving area smiling, saying on behalf of the Adventurers Guild across the kingdom of Sapin, allow her to congratulate and welcome him. Arthur picks up the license card from the box and excitedly checks it. Meanwhile, someone calls him from behind. He turns his head to look, and Sylvia, sitting on Arthur's shoulder, looking toward that person, says go and train scrubs. Jasmine puts her hand on Arthur's shoulder, saying he may still be a newcomer, but is an adventurer now. Arthur heads up and looks toward her. Then she showed him the license card and said he was one of them. He holds the card and looks at it, thinking he is an adventurer. As noted, he was free from the ties that held back Arthur Lewin's life. Then, holding the handle of his sword, he thought that today's duel with Caspian had confirmed many things for him. He would spend too much time adjusting to and learning this world's magic system, Sylvia's beast will. Furthermore, he thinks that by honing his elemental magic, he would become so engrossed in the abilities he had gained coming to this world that he would dismiss training in the very thing he was best at in the past. He had utilized most of his meager Kai pool to refine the most straightforward techniques in the world, though his limitations didn't exist, so should he keep pursuing magic? While thinking about this, Arthur was lost in his thoughts. Suddenly, he bumps into someone. He heads up, looks toward that boy, and apologizes. Sylvia sits on his shoulder and surprisingly looks toward that boy. However, Arthur and that boy look toward each other and look toward him. Arthur thinks he is one of the examinees today, the one ranked B as well, but without having to test. As Arthur apologized to him, the boy angrily turned his head and squeezed his eyes, responding, "It's okay." Meanwhile, Lucas gets there from behind, asking what this is. They know each other as he stands there with his soldier and maid behind him. He looks toward them both and asks if there is a meeting for the new B-class adventurers happenings that he should know about. Looking toward Lucas, Arthur asks why he plans to throw a tantrum again. If there was, Lucas angrily grits his teeth, answering, "Don't get cocky just because they happen to be ranked in the same class." Then Lucas comes near Arthur and angrily points toward him, saying even within ranks, there are levels and commoners would be at the bottom. And don't he forget it. Then he hit Arthur's shoulder and